speaker series. For our first sessions and our premier series, we have Dr. Sarah Gardiner with us here today. Hello, Sarah. How are you?
Hi, everyone.
Today's topics, we're going to talk about how to organize research and obtaining grant as a research institution. We decide upon this topic because as we, Prasetiya Mulya, move as a teaching university into a research university, I thought we need some tips and notes about how to start being more productive in terms of research and how to do it well, especially in order to submit to a Q1 journal. So just a little bit, my name is Redha. I'm the head and undergraduate tourism business program department head. I will be moderating this session. As a start, I'm gonna give this session a rundown. So the rundown will be from 9 to 9:10. We're gonna have a little bit of warm up and then a little bit of introductions. And then Dr. Gardiner, we're gonna present his presentations, and then afterwards it's going to be followed with a question and answer and discussions, and hopefully it's going to be a lively discussions, and hopefully it's going to be very insightful and helpful to your research competencies building. As a house rules for this sessions, please turn off your audio and video while the speaker is presenting. If you do have questions towards Sarah, please include #question for speaker in your line of question. Unfortunately, we may not be able to address all your questions given the speaker's time availability, and we will truly appreciate if you fill our post-session survey to help us improve this series for the future. So a little bit about our guest speaker today and our distinguished speaker today. Dr. Sarah Gardiner is an associate professor at Griffith University. She's also holding as well director of Griffith's Institute of Tourism from 2012 till now. She's also a deputy of director of Tourism Australia. She earned her degree in Ph.D. in marketing in Griffith University, as well as her bachelor in business and in exercise science. A few of her notable projects include Gold Coast City, our tourism city development framework, which is part of the destination marketing, which is the first for the Gold Coast cities. Also, she coordinates projects at Sydney 2000 Olympics. There are also various projects in which hopefully she will talk about under the Griffith Institute of Tourism. Her special interest in research is in tourism, consumer behavior, economic development, and marketing. Without further ado, please let us welcome Dr. Sarah Gardiner to the Zoom session. Sarah, yeah, you may present now. Let me stop sharing.
Thank you, Redha. Thank you for that wonderful introduction and introducing my presentation. And hello to everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this session. Hopefully, I will talk for a little while around some of the work that I do at Griffith University, and then we'll have an opportunity for some questions and answers. If you could please put your answers in the chat. So as was mentioned earlier, I'm from Griffith University, which is located in Queensland in Australia. I'm actually based we have 5 campuses, but I'm based at the Gold Coast campus and very lucky to be a tourism researcher located in a major tourism destination. So prior to the pandemic, the Gold Coast attracted about 10 million visitors a year, a large percentage of day trippers, but roughly around 20% of international visitors and 80% of domestic or Australian visitors. Obviously, like most tourism destinations around the world, we've been quite significantly affected by the pandemic. Prior to the pandemic, about 1 in 5 jobs on the Gold Coast were in the tourism and hospitality sector. So much like many regions around Indonesia, such as Bali, we were quite heavily impacted by the closure of international borders. We're very much an international tourism city. And so I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about the research that we're doing at the Griffith Institute for Tourism, and also some of the opportunities for the future in terms of thinking about your setting your research agenda and where you take your institution moving forward. So as was mentioned before, I'm an associate professor in tourism. I've been in academia just over 10 years now. Prior to that, I was in industry working in local government and around tourism industry development. I've done quite a bit of work in Indonesia. We run a program for the Australian government, which is an Australian Awards short course where we train operators, community leaders in Indonesia around sustainable tourism practice. And we've been running that for quite a few years now. We're actually just been appointed to deliver the 7th course in sustainable tourism into Indonesia. And so that program will kick off soon in Indonesia. We have about 150 alumni in Indonesia that have undertaken that course so far. But before we get started today, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I'm meeting on today, which is the Kombumerri people, which are part of the Yugambeh language group. And just to acknowledge and pay my respects to the elders past and present, and extend respect to all the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in this community. Interestingly, as we move forward with just that acknowledgement of country, and as we move forward in terms of the reopening with the pandemic, on the other side of this pandemic, the importance of involving Indigenous people and Aboriginal Indigenous people in Australia in the rebuilding of tourism and the future of tourism is really fundamental as part of our reconciliation with Indigenous people. So I just want to acknowledge that to begin today's presentation. I thought I'd start off today just talking a little bit about tourism at Griffith University and how we're structured, just to help you in terms of thinking about setting up your tourism, hospitality and events program in your institute. When I originally came to Griffith, I was employed under the Department of Tourism, Sport and Hotel Management. So that's a department within our Griffith Business School. However, back in 2014, the university decided to make a strategic investment in its tourism research and established a standalone tourism institute. So I'm now the director of that institute. And basically that institute is about coordinating the tourism research across the university. So I have researchers in my institute that are not just from the Department of Tourism, Sport and Hotel Management, but come from architecture, planning, environmental science, aviation, health, and so forth. So we're very much a multidisciplinary institute, whole of university institute that looks at tourism research, which is a little bit different to a lot of other universities where they tend to concentrate just tourism with tourism researchers. We very much view tourism research at Griffith University to cross across a number of different areas. Interestingly, some of the areas that we're now starting to work a lot closer with is in the health area, working with occupational therapists around accessible tourism. So making tourism accommodation, tourism attractions and tourism spaces more accessible for people with accessibility issues. We're working a lot closer with our specialists in things like migration, because obviously a key issue for the tourism industry is workforce. So we're working quite closely with the specialists in migration around how do we actually start to use visa policy as a way of bringing visitors into the destination. And I know Indonesia, that's been a hot topic in the news just of late in terms of the digital nomad visa that I don't know exactly what it's being called over there, but from afar, I kind of see it as the digital nomad visa where people can come in to Indonesia and work and also holiday and stay for an extended period of time. So I think that's very innovative in terms of the visa policy space. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there. We also have a number of our researchers that work in areas such as planning and architecture and things that help to design tourism experiences. So I think that's a bit of a unique part of our institute. We are Australia's largest tourism research institute. We have about 34 academic members, 8 adjunct members, and about 33 PhD candidates. And Made, who's on the line today, is actually studying his PhD. He's from Indonesia and studying his PhD here with me in Australia. So we have a number of Indonesian PhD candidates now that are coming and studying our program as well. I was asked to talk today a little bit about some of the metrics and some of the ways in which you build your reputation as a leading tourism school. And one way in which we measure the success of our tourism program is the World University Rankings. So there's a number of different rankings. The ranking that I'm just about to show you now is the Shanghai University Rankings, but there's also the QS World University Rankings and a number of other different sorts of ranking systems. Griffith tends to perform quite well in these systems, and this is really a great way in terms of building your reputation as a leading tourism and leading school of tourism and hospitality. It's a very competitive space. I mentioned before, we have about 34 researchers. The universities at the top of the ranking, so sort of 1 and 2, have about 75, so almost have, you know, over double the number of universities working in that space. So you might want to have a look at the rankings. But in terms of Griffith University, the latest Shanghai World University Rankings, we're ranked #1 in Australia and #5 in the world in terms of tourism and hospitality. We often use that in terms of establishing our credibility as a world leading tourism research university. We also have a ranking system in Australia that's run by our national government, so the Australian Research Council, and they also review the universities in the various subject areas and provide a ranking. And in their last round of rankings, we received what we call an excellence in research for Australia, ranking of 5, and 5 is actually the highest you can receive. Only 2 universities in Australia receive this rating in the tourism area, ourselves and the University of Queensland. So and if you get a 5 out of 5, it's basically recognises your tourism research as well above world standards in terms of the types of outputs that you're creating. So I think in terms of establishing your tourism program, thinking about some of the metrics you can use as a university to start to build your credibility as a top ranking tourism university. In the Griffith Institute for Tourism, as I said, we've got quite a comprehensive program of research being undertaken. Across our 30+ researchers, we have expertise in 4 pillars. So we organise them under 4 pillars, expertise in economics and visitor statistics. So you can see under there, we've just highlighted some of our key expertise. We do a lot of work in experience design and innovation, so working with tourism operators and tourism destinations in terms of building their experiences they offer in the destination. We do quite a lot of work around sustainability and climate change, and also around events. So I think it's really important as you start to kind of, you know, look at your university and where you want to kind of, what are your core strengths and what are your core areas of expertise that you can offer to stakeholders, be they government, industry, or other organisations, in terms of some of the work that you could do in that research space. So we spent a bit of time kind of mapping our key expertise in those areas, and particularly thinking about where our strategic strengths are in terms of our research capacity. So that might be something you're interested in doing, is sitting down with your team, thinking about where their research interests lie, where their expertise lies. So not just thinking about your interests, but also your technical abilities to be able to do certain sorts of analysis. So you can see there under experience design and innovation, we've got things like sentiment analysis using big data, and so we've become quite specialized in being able to undertake that type of analysis for people, and where you could see your strategic opportunity lies in terms of really positioning your university in that space. So today's presentation, apart from just talking a little bit about Griffith's research capabilities, I want to talk a little bit about the types of scholarly outputs and research impact that you could create and how you go about creating that. Look at emerging research topics, and also think about different approaches to research, and particularly thinking about the academic journals and the types of methodologies that they're looking for in terms of the types of papers that they'll be accepting from a research perspective. So I wanted to start the discussion thinking about creating outcomes and impacts. And interestingly, as we move forward as academics, some of the key areas we're thinking about is we really need to serve two sorts of masters. We've got the academic masters, where we're really thinking about our academic performance and the key metrics associated with that. And then we have our responsibility to government and industry and key stakeholders in terms of our academic impact. I'll just spend a moment talking about academic performance metrics in terms of where what helps to build your reputation, both you individually as a researcher, but also the university's reputation through having world-leading researchers. So obviously, and traditionally, the focus has been on publications. There's also always been this debate between the quantity of publications and the quality of those publications. So as part of building yourself as an international leading researcher, you need to build a significant bank of publications in terms of the number of publications. I'll talk a little bit in a moment about the types of publications you could aim towards, but I think you need to think about, building that that volume of publications. Interestingly, something that was said to me very early on in my career, and I perhaps didn't believe it at the time because I was so eager to get started and build my track record in terms of academic publications, is that it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. So when you start to measure your success and how you're going, often when you've just completed your PhD, you feel perhaps a little bit overwhelmed that, you see people with 30 or 40 publications and you think, oh, that's a long way to go. I've got a long career, a long way to get from 0 or 1 or 2 publications up to 40 publications. But you've got to remember academia is quite a long career. And if you're benchmarking yourself, maybe benchmark against yourself against other people at a similar stage in their career. So when you're just starting out, maybe doing your PhD or just completing your PhD, what is the sort of number of publications that people in that stage of their career are at? Don't try to, in that early career stage, benchmark yourself against, a world-leading professor, because that's the marathon. Okay, they haven't created and built that career overnight. They've built it through really a long-term track record in terms of building up that number of publications. However, in Australia and in many other parts around the world, the focus has really shifted from not just quantity of publications, but really a focus on the quality of those publications. And what I mean by that is publishing in the really top tier journals that have a really high impact factor. So in the tourism area, those top journals would be journals such as Tourism Management, the Journal of Travel Research, Journal of Sustainable Tourism. Are just some of the ones that are Annals of Tourism Research are some of the ones that are at the top tier, high impact tourism journals. There's a different group of journals if you're publishing in events, and a different group of journals maybe for the hospitality researchers in your group. But you need to know a little bit about the concept of an impact factor. So that's how much impact that potential publication is going to have, which potentially leads on to my next point around citations. Often you find if you publish in journals with high impact factors, your work is more likely to be read and more likely to therefore be cited. And so that's the benefit of publishing in the journals with the really high profile, a lot more prestigious, but also the fact that they get a lot more exposure and tend to get a lot more citations as such. Interestingly, at Griffith, our focus now is much more on the number of citations than even the number of publications and the quality. So if you publish lots of papers in high quality journals, then that will often lead to lots of citations, but you need to be thinking about that. The other thing I'd say in the case of that, in terms of the type of research you're doing, if you're doing research in a very niche area that only a few people are working in, you're less likely to get lots of citations because there's less people working in that area. If you write a paper in an area that a lot of people are working in and a lot of people are interested in, the more people are going to use your research and the more likely you are to be cited. So there was a paper that was just published recently, I think it was about 2 years ago, on tourism and big data by one of our members at the Griffith Institute for Tourism, and was one of the highly cited papers in a top tier journal, because it was working in an area that was very topical, of interest to a lot of researchers, and therefore formed the basis of a lot of other, sort of inspired a lot of other research studies. So increasingly the focus is on this metric of citations. And that perhaps leads to the next metric that I'm going to talk about in terms of the H index. So that basically reflects the number of people that have cited their paper and the number of articles. So as an early career researcher, you might have 1 or 2 or maybe 5 people that have cited your paper in different articles. But as you move through your career, as your citations build up and your reputation builds up, then the opportunity to also increase your H index as well, which is another metric we use. So for me, that's some of the key academic performance metrics. There are others, but they're some of the key ones that we tend to focus on at Griffith University, and I'd say more broadly in terms of tourism research. The other area that's becoming increasingly important, both in Australia and in other places around the world, and in the United Kingdom has done quite a lot of work in this space, is around academic impact. And this is a definition from the Australian Research Council. And basically it says that academic impact is research impact is the contribution that research makes to the economy, society, environment, or culture beyond the contribution to academic research. So I mentioned before, we sort of have 2 masters in academia. We've got these sort of academic performance metrics, which obviously the university and the academic and scholarly community is very interested in terms of how important your research is. But increasingly this focus that your research just can't be published in top tier journals and you can't just make an impact on academia. You actually need to make this impact outside of academia, more broadly on the economy, society, environment, or culture, beyond that contribution to research academia. So I'm just going to talk about that in a little bit more detail in terms of your strategy moving forward. So I mentioned before, in terms of scholarly outputs, some ways in which you can generate scholarly outputs, and this is not a comprehensive list, but some of the 3 key main ways in which you would do that would be to write a full research paper or a research note in an academic journal. You could write a book, which is fabulous and often builds a lot of reputation, or you might just write a book chapter. And this book chapter could be a research book chapter based upon your research, which is written up into a book chapter, or it could be a teaching orientated book chapter. So something that where you may write a case study, and I'm going to give you an example of this in a moment, that could be used in the classroom as part of teaching, and often then you'll have some teaching notes associated with that. So if someone was to take it into a seminar or a workshop at a university, there's some questions for students discussion, and there's some discussion about, there's some teaching notes to help people actually run a class based upon that book chapter. Another way you can build your reputation and build your scholarly outputs is publish conference papers and presentations. Now, often these are a great way in terms of a stepping stone to lead to a full journal paper or a research note. But often a conference paper or a presentation which presents maybe a part of the research you're working on, maybe it's a work in progress, that can give you some really good feedback in terms of developing your research into a full journal paper. I also think going to academic conferences is a great way of really building your understanding of what other researchers are doing in academia, but also your understanding of research more generally, and particularly methodologies. I mentioned before that we've got these 2 masters, so it's not just about scholarly outputs these days, it's also about the impact outcomes, and some ways in which you can create impact beyond academia is talking about your research with the media. So thinking about maybe writing a press release, or if there's topical issues that are coming up in the news related to your particular topic, then you could maybe work with your media unit at your university to see if that journalist or the journalists in that particular area are interested about talking with you as an expert in that particular area. So your area might be cruise tourism, and you see something come up on the news about the restart of cruise in Indonesia, and what that means in terms of the Indonesian tourism industry. So you might reach out to your media unit and say, look, I've got expertise in this area. I hear this is what the media are talking about at the moment, and I can make some comment in that space. You also need a website, so you can visit the Griffith Institute for Tourism website. You can see we've got quite a lot of information about the research that we're working on at the moment, updates on our projects and so forth. We've got blogs and videos that people can see the types of research that we're working on. We also actively use social media channels. So we have accounts. Our main two platforms that we use are Facebook and LinkedIn, and we actively work those channels to make sure people know about our researchers, know about our research and what's happening. We also may just comment on other people's research or stories that are happening in the media and share that with our network as well. You can, and again, you can see examples of this on the Griffith Institute for Tourism website. Reports and infographics and case studies are a really great way to create impact and get industry to understand and take up your research. And the other thing I suggest you do is more industry presentations and training and so forth. How am I going for time? Just let me have a look. Okay, I've got a few more minutes. I've got about 10 more minutes left. Is that right?
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, take your time.
Great. I might have to flick over a few slides, but that's okay. I want to talk just quickly about one project as an example of creating research impact. So this project related, and you may have been aware, back in 2019, 2020, Australia had a number of major bushfire events all around the country. And this was known as the Black Summer bushfire event. One of the first events that occurred was just in our backyard, actually, here on the Gold Coast, was at a place called Binnaburra Lodge. And you can see on the left-hand side of the screen there, pictures of the lodge before and after the fire. Binnaburra Lodge was a well-loved place amongst the Gold Coast community and the Australian community, and had some heritage listed lodges. The fire came through and basically burnt those lodges to the ground. So it was had quite a devastating impact on the local community, and there was a bit of an outpouring of emotion across Australia for the destruction of those lodges. The Binnaburra Lodge sits on the edge of the Gondwana rainforest, which is a really significant World Heritage listed rainforest. And this was an unprecedented event because that area of Australia typically did not burn, but we had very dry conditions beforehand, which resulted in the fire. So it was quite an unusual event. I've worked with a team of researchers, and you can see us there in various pictures around in that slide. What is significant about this is we're all not tourism researchers. So Margarita and myself are tourism researchers, but you can see Corinne there in the middle picture with the blonde hair. She's actually an architect and town planner. So she came together. We've got Jim and Guy, who are Guy's the person with the echidna in his hands, and Jim's the person with the hat on. So Guy is an ecologist and Jim's a environmental economist. We all came together around this project to look at the idea around disaster resilience. We've done a number of things working on this project. We've published articles we've published an article in Journal of Travel Research around the research we undertook, interviewing key stakeholders. We published a case study, which is on the Griffith Institute for Tourism website. We also published a teaching case study as a book chapter. We've done quite a lot of media interviews during the period of the Black Summer bushfire. We were quoted in over 200 stories. Corinne and Margarita led a project to actually, based upon the interviews we did with local stakeholders, they actually built a pavilion which was located at Binnaburra Lodge and at other locations around the region, moved to other locations around the region. But you can see there on the walls of the pavilion, we had actually captured the stories of the community and their reaction to the bushfire events. So really put our research out there in that community-based pavilion. About 4,000 people visited that pavilion over the course of a few months that it was available. So great engagement in terms of our research, so great engagement in terms of impact. The work we're doing now, so you can see in the top right-hand picture, the work we're doing now is working with 20 local businesses and community leaders in the region that was affected, which is known as the Scenic Rim, looking at ways in which we can better prepare them and build more resilience in that community moving forward when future disaster events occur. Very much we take it of the mindset, it's not if, but when more disaster will strike that region. So we really want to build the resilience within the local community to be able to adapt. And so we're using our research skills and knowledge in different areas, be it architecture, business, economics, ecology, and so forth, to really help build that resilience within that community. So I thought that was a good example of being able to achieve both scholarly outputs in terms of journal publications, teaching case studies, but also a lot of research impact as well in terms of the pavilion, the news media stories, and so forth. So I think that's a good example of being able to achieve both things using one piece of research. The other thing that we wanted to talk about today was some emerging research topics, because as I mentioned before, it's really important when you're thinking about your research, you obviously have the stuff that's really dear to your heart and things that you're really interested in, but it's also really important that you're working on research that other people are interested in as well. Because if you want people to cite you, you want people to read your paper and read your research, then it can't just be of interest to you, it needs to be of interest to a broader audience. So some of the things that I think are really topical at the moment, and perhaps not surprising, around climate change and sustainability, but I'm seeing a real gap in the literature and an opportunity to talk more about what we call ESG, which is environment, social and governance, and particularly at the senior leadership and board level, ESG is something that's become quite topical, and I haven't seen a lot of that talked about in terms of the tourism literature. So I think there is an opportunity to really think about not just operationally how we deal with climate change and sustainability, but how we deal with the policies and governance that can happen at a senior management and a board level within the tourism industry. I think there's a lot of interest around tourism in developing countries. Interestingly, I sit on the board of Journal of Travel Research, and we just had a board meeting recently, the editorial board meeting recently, and we were talking about the opportunity to really highlight emerging destinations and new destinations beyond kind of the ones that are typically mentioned in the journals, which tend to be destinations such as the US, UK, Australia, and China. The opportunity to see other destinations starting to be, and research in other destinations starting to be more prolific in those journals. So I think there's lots of opportunities for Indonesia, in terms of there's lots of things happening in Indonesia in terms of the development of destinations, the 10 new Balis and so forth. I think there's lots of opportunities for that research to really have a strong impact on the tourism journals, and also for your research to have an impact beyond academia in terms of the development of those destinations. Probably an area related to the Binabara research that I mentioned earlier is around this resilience. You can see that and again, it sort of links to climate change in the senses as we see the environment changing, there's more likelihood of things like pandemics and disasters occurring. So research around pandemic recovery and the future health emergencies that may occur, disaster management and visitor safety, I think are going to be really hot emerging topics in the tourism journals. In Indonesia and in many other places around the world, including Australia, there's major workforce issues as part of the restart of tourism and the recovery following the pandemic. And I think there's lots of research opportunities and hot topics in that space. Some work that we've been doing is around new technologies and how tourism and hospitality and the events industry adopt these new technologies. So things like artificial intelligence, virtual and augmented realities, big data and automation. I think things like driverless cars, what does that mean for the tourism industry? All those sorts of things. So I think that's a really big area. And the other area is demographic changes. So I was just going to briefly talk about an area that I do quite a bit of research in, is around youth tourism So we can see that it's a major part of the world travel market. And you can see that it's, the UNWTO estimated there's almost 3 million international youth trips per year globally by 2020. And I know Indonesia does very well in this demographic. And interestingly, we just had the Australian census data released today, and the millennials or Gen Ys are actually equal to the baby boomer population now in Australia. So in terms of a target market for Indonesia, the youth market is definitely core to that. And the two areas that I particularly look at is Gen Y and Gen Z, and it's estimated they'll be representing about 63% of the global population in the near future. And so this is a really important market. For Australia, prior to the pandemic, youth tourists represented about 25% of all international visitor arrivals to Australia and about 44% of international visitor spend. And they tend to disperse more widely around the country than most other international visitor types. So I think there's lots of opportunities in terms of future research, particularly in the youth tourism market, particularly around repeat visitations and the work that could be done there around developing this sort of lifetime love of a destination. I think youth tourism offers a lot of opportunity, particularly with the geopolitical tensions that are happening around the world at the moment around diplomacy and reputational benefits. And I also think youth tourism, and at the core of a lot of the working holiday maker visa programs is this idea of cross-cultural understanding. So at the core of working holiday maker visas and also international study arrangements and visas that are offered between countries, this opportunity to use young people to build understanding between different countries is really, really important. I might just skip over that in terms of the working holiday makers, because we're just running out of time. So I won't talk about that market in particular, but I just wanted to quickly talk about the different approaches to research. So we obviously have two main approaches that many of you are already pretty aware of, is around the quantitative approaches and the qualitative approaches to research. I think in the quantitative area, we're seeing a big move away from just relying on survey data to the move to use big data. And what I mean by that is data such as social media data to measure consumer sentiment rather than asking people or surveying people to work out whether they have a positive or negative attitude towards a destination. So I can see that moving forward. What we're seeing in the top tier journals and across the tourism research landscape is really multi-phase research. So a lot of the top tier journals are not accepting papers where there's just one phase of data collection and analysis. So for example, someone conducts a survey, they analyze the data, and that becomes the foundation of that their research contribution in their research paper. They're really wanting research that's a lot more comprehensive than that. So maybe a survey to begin with, and then maybe some experimental research to really kind of confirm the findings of the survey, or maybe conducting interviews first to get that really in-depth understanding, and then doing another phase of research to confirm that understanding, maybe using quantitative methods. So apart from multi-phase design, something I'm seeing in the journals a lot more is using experimental design in tourism research. So it's where we're conducting experiments to test whether what we're finding or what we think in terms of our hypotheses or our propositions are actually correct. And one area that we're doing that at Griffith University is using eye tracking technology. And this is where you get people to look at a screen and it creates heat maps as to what they pay attention to. This is an example of one of the data outputs where you can actually follow where people's eyes move on a page. So you can see number 1 in the top left corner, then 2, 3, 4, which tracks the actual movement of the eye around, say, a website page. And you can see here just some other examples of what they pay attention to. Interestingly, what they don't pay attention to. So if you were the scent ad, you can see there that person paid no attention to the lady with the flower in her hair at all. And people do tend to pay attention to, and maybe it goes back to our fundamental biological premise, people's faces. So you can see here in the top example, people really looking and taking note of what faces are in the presentation. The eye tracking data also creates sort of these heat spots. So this is how long people have paid attention to a particular spot on the page. Sometimes we scan and move our eyes very quickly, but other times we really pay attention to a particular location on the page, and that's when you get this sort of red spots happen. And you can see here, this is some of the work we did with Intrepid Travel in terms of their Thailand tour, and in terms of where the various areas of interest were on their website. And you can see here the main areas of interests that they particularly wanted to look at: corporate social responsibility, messaging on their tour page were the Intrepid logo, the carbon icon, the message about the no elephant rides, carbon information at the bottom of the page, the price and date information, and the review section. So you can start to see what people actually are paying attention to on those websites. The other area we're using the eye tracking and big data is to look at things measuring beauty, and in this case the beauty of the barrier reef. So this is some research that's being conducted by Susanna Becken and Professor Balastantic, and used what we call human sensors. So picked up on Twitter posts, and you can see in the graph there we could start to look at whether there was positive, negative, or neutral Twitter posts, and what those the different types of marine species generated different types of responses. Again, I mentioned before about multi-phase data collection. They also use survey data, they use stakeholder data, and also eye tracking. So you can see in the middle picture there where they were looking at eye tracking. They also used in the bottom picture with the fish, they also used some artificial intelligence to start to identify or analyze pictures to identify various fish that were swimming in that particular part of the reef, in terms of the photos that people were taking in that particular part of the reef. So I think that's a good example of the sort of new methodologies that are starting to come through. So that is what I had to present to you today. I'll stop sharing my screen. That was probably a lot of information to take in a very short period of time. You gave me a big agenda in terms of things to cover, but hopefully I've done it good justice, and hopefully there's some good questions there to unpack some of that information in a bit more detail.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sarah, for the presentations. There's a lot of new insights that we gather, especially about the tourism cluster, about making an impact into the tourism community as well as the society at large as a academic institution. I thought that was really a refreshing take. And then really interested knowing the new ways to gather data, such as the eye tracking. Is it with Toby? Is it Toby?
Toby, yes, Toby.
Yeah.
Yes.
Toby, the name of the technology, because I thought that was really interesting, because especially for travel, now we are more dependent on applications and websites that then the eyeball gets higher percentage of, we are not paying much attention to it. So I thought that was really neat, especially as e-commerce, especially tourism e-commerce are booming up in Indonesia and everywhere else in the world. So that was really interesting. I'd like to pass this on to the audience. If there are any questions that you'd like to ask Sarah, you can either put your line of questioning in the chat, or you can ask Sarah directly. Is there anyone?
It's always hard being the first one to ask.
Yes. I think it's the morning effect, because everybody's just came back from and then they probably have a lot of stuff also going on right now, especially with the final exam coming up.
Pak Redha, can I use a comment?
Yes, Pak Himpunan, silakan.
All right. Yes. Good morning, Sarah.
Good morning.
My name is Pak Himpunan, but you can call me Punky. All right. Thank you very much for your presentation. It's very great value that we can gather from that. My doctorate degree is in tourism, economic tourism. So I'm quite interested to do the research in that area. My first question is, can you share with us how you find the resource in terms of finance to financing the research. That is the first. The second, can we have some kind of collaboration between yours and ours in terms of doing research together? The objective can be, let's say, in Indonesia perspective or Australia perspective or both perspective. So, and the third, I don't know, Pak Redha, I'm thinking actually, Pak Redha, I
Yes.
comments also, Pak Redha as the chairman of the tourism's department, and Sarah, of course. I'm thinking, why not we say establish, let's say, Prasetiya Mulya Tourism Research Center, and Dr. Sarah will be kind of sometime the bridging of, like, say, consulting for us in this moment. That is the third. Because why I said that, because besides I'm a faculty member in tourism department, I also taking part as the director of Prasetiya Mulya Cooperation Affairs. So I need to, trying to bridging these issues. But for sure, my mandatory is my life in the hand of Pak Redha as my chairman. Anyway, thank you, Pak. Back to you, Pak Redha.
You're welcome. Thank you so much. I thought that was a great idea. I think that's something that we can look forward to, also help us to build competencies and more interest in tourism. So now, so there are three questions. One is about resources to do this type of research. Second is potential collaborations between Griffith and Universitas Prasetiya Mulya. And then your thoughts about building up a tourism research center, if there's any way that Griffith may be able to provide some kind of guidance or support on it. So
sure. So I'll start with the first one regarding, sorry, did you want me to ask the economics question? I think there was a question first around, Paki mentioned around the economics side of things.
I believe so, yeah. Is it?
Yeah. I'll just answer that one first. So in terms of the economics in Australia, we have a national visitor survey and an international visitor survey, and then also which sort of feeds into a survey of tourism satellite accounts. I think there are some data sets available in Indonesia, probably not quite as advanced as what's in Australia. Australia has been collecting this data for quite some time, which I'm not an economist, but I know that economists like lots of longitudinal data to help measure trends and things like that. So that's probably of interest. A lot of those data sets are collected and funded. The data collection is funded by the Australian government. So I think there is opportunity with Indonesia and definitely the collaboration between Australia and Indonesia around working on better data sets. And I think that's something that could really benefit the industry. We're just undertaking some work for the Australian government at the moment around tourism indicators. And we've just been looking at sort of an international review of tourism indicators, and there's lots of movement in this space in terms of providing better measures of the impact of tourism, not just from an economic perspective, but from a people and place perspective. So from a social and an environmental perspective and a cultural perspective. And so I think that is a really emerging area of research, and particularly understanding how we measure tourism in developing destinations. I think this is a really emerging area of research. So I encourage you to look at that particular space. I think the other question was around funding of research and where we get funding to do research. Some of the money comes through internal funding through the university. So we do run internal grant programs where often quite small amounts of money can be used to sort of pilot and develop concepts for research. If we are doing a larger scale research project, such as that Barrier Reef project that I showed you in my presentation, even the research we've done with Widarsyah Lodge on the resilience planning, often that's funded through government grants. So whether it's through, I mentioned earlier in my presentation, the Australian Research Council, which is like an academic grant scheme, or we tend to apply and work with industry partners to apply for industry grants that universities or universities working with industry partners can apply for. I think that's an opportunity. I think there are opportunities as well to develop proposals and then directly pitch that to government, because often we find, and I'm sure I know it's the same in Indonesia, is that government officers don't think about problems in terms of research solutions. So often you need to work with industry, identify a problem, and then develop a research proposal that helps the industry solve that problem or the government solve that problem, and then pitch that research to them. But they won't be thinking that way at all. They'll be thinking about, I've got this problem and I need a policy solution. But we try to position it in a way that it's an evidence-based policy solution. So doing some research to help inform what the best policy is in that particular circumstance can really help them guide their policies and programs for the government. And when we also work with commercial industry partners as well, and local destination managers and communities in terms of community-based solutions as well. So I think there's, you need to build those relationships and have those good partnerships, so you can be seen as a key friend or a key partner in terms of providing a solution to problems as well. Yeah, I think there's, as I said, I do quite a bit of work in Indonesia through the Australian government DFAT Australia Awards program. So very keen, and I know Griffith is very keen to continue to build relationships in Indonesia. So we'll continue that conversation about the opportunities with yourselves at the university in terms of building this sort of research. I'm very passionate about building the research culture in Indonesia, because I think there's so much potential there, and you can't have a strong tourism industry without a strong knowledge base, a knowledge hub. And that's where building the capacity within Indonesian universities to deliver, and academia to deliver that kind of knowledge that's going to underpin the long-term sustainability of the Indonesian tourism industry, I think is really important.
Thanks, Sarah. I hope that answers your questions, Pak Pangki.
I agree with you, Dr. Sarah. Most of Indonesians' tourism research is always based on economic perspective. It's only view that we can see people doing research in ecotourism, as we have now. We have here Pak Made. We have now problem in Bali actually. That time to Bali is a very, what we call a very good destination for tourism in terms of a quiet time to take a rest there. But now it's very polluted. Only I think it is good also to do some research how we sustain this kind of Bali become a potential destinations in the futures. But if we cannot maintain this pollution that already raised by this industry, I mean tourism as an industry, sometimes we lost Bali as a potential destination. Many research that we have conducted here in Indonesia, unfortunately, is always talk about, including me. I have to say that my research during my doctorate degree is actually trying to see the FDI, foreign direct investments, towards tourism's. In tourism industry towards the economic growth. Then most of the students and most of the scholar here is always related with that. And I agree with you, Sarah, what you said just now. You mentioned about we have to see the potential research in other sectors rather than economic perspective. Thank you, Sarah.
No worries. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. I thought that was really interesting to bring a point in which, for example, I just listened to an interview by Erick Thohir, which is the Minister of the National Enterprises, called BUMN, which hold very significant holdings in the nation's infrastructure, Sarah. And one of the things that I was really kind of taken back, especially when he was talking about one of our major aircraft airline, which is Garuda Indonesia, is that he shifted his focus from international travel toward more domestic. And then I just recently arrived from a trip to Yogyakarta, and the focus on bringing local wisdom and local made products into the forefront, for example, in the airport area, in the terminals, are intensifying, I would say, because then it's a really interesting new mindset. I think that comes also from our administrator, our presidents, in which the direction which is to go local everything. So local hotels, local arts and crafts. So and then even with Garuda Indonesia, which is usually primarily focused on international travelers, now he said that it'll be 70% of the passengers, of the total passengers carried, will be mostly domestic. So I thought that was kind of like, oh, that's kind of revealing. Like, you know, there's much more focus now on local tourism, because Indonesia has a huge amount of populations. We are in archipelago, so the chance of domestic travel is huge. And also during the pandemic, when I just recently watched our occupancy data, especially for Java, the big cities in Java, it stays quite well and on par with some of the big cities in Southeast Asia, even in Asia Pacific, in terms of occupancy levels. So I thought that shows the resilience of domestic tourism, especially in Indonesia. Now I'd like to offer other participants who have questions to Sarah. Maybe Widarsyah, maybe, or
We can see Penny.
yes, Penny. Okay.
Hi, Professor Sarah. How are you?
I'm good. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you, Professor. I'm Penny. I'm a faculty member in the tourism department, majoring events management. So thank you for your comprehensive presentations. What I'd like to ask to you is about your strategy in order to achieve you mentioned in the first presentation the different areas of research in your universities. So will you, how do you achieve all of the areas? Is it recruiting the researchers who have a certain interest to that area, or you give order to your team to research in that specific area in order to achieve the comprehensive or the all of the area that you design. Since in our universities we have a lack of human resources, and we are all the like junior researchers, so we are doing we are looking for what is our passion in research. So we need you to explain your strategy to achieve that. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Penny, for those comments. I think really important in terms of your strategy moving forward. A couple of things I'd say there is it sort of works both ways for us. So those 4 pillars that I mentioned came from conversations with our existing researchers in terms of where they thought their research lay and where our kind of key strengths are in terms of research. So I suppose there's a bit of history associated with that, because we've all kind of, that's been around for quite a few years now. So people are sort of aligned their research with those areas. The other thing is we do strategically recruit into areas where we feel there's lots of potential. So at the moment, we're actually advertising for a professor in tourism economics, which is quite particular, but we feel like we've got a little bit of a gap in our team in terms of that economics area at the moment. So really keen to find a really senior professor to help mentor that area. I think it is good to have a balance of researchers from early career researchers right through to professors in terms of each of those pillars. We do, obviously make sure when we're working on projects to have perhaps the professor or associate professor leading the project, but always involve our early career researchers in those projects. So we build that capacity internally to learn about how to conduct research and particularly deliver projects for when we're working with external clients such as government and industry. And that also, in terms of development of papers as a result of that research, really helps to build their track record as well. So I think that's really important to make sure that's the opportunity. You also find when you start to have a good understanding of your particular research interests, it helps in terms of, so we have quite a big PhD program. So people now come to our university because they know we've got those specializations, and we tend to attract PhDs who are interested in those areas as well, moving forward. The other thing I'd say to you, you did mention that there may not be capacity in your university to say have like a cluster or a pillar, say, on events, which you're obviously very interested in. But are there other universities that you could partner with and develop like a cluster between universities? So for us, I mentioned before, the other leading university, which is just on our back doorstep, is the University of Queensland. And we often do, in that event space, we often do collaborative research with them because they have a strong team of event researchers, so do we, and working together, we build up a better capacity across those two organisations. So maybe if you don't have that capacity in your university, are there other universities, other kind of neighbouring universities? It sometimes helps. It'd be fine to have a university a long way away, but often if you're geographically clustered, it helps as well. So if you can maybe in your neighbouring universities, just one or two event researchers in that area, and that you can kind of come together on a regular basis and collaborate and try to work on projects. That's another way of building that capacity in a particular stream, and building your profile in that stream, and then making sure you're talking to government and other key stakeholders about the opportunity to do event research.
Okay, thank you, Sarah, for
Thank you.
your explanation. I'm sure you did an amazing job to do the both ways in order to achieve your design. Do we have a time, Pak Redha, to discuss? Or?
Discuss, sure. Would you like to ask additional question, but Penny?
Yes.
Okay, sure, no problem. We still have until 10:30, so that's okay.
Okay. So I'm going to discuss with you about the impact. How do you track or measure the impact of your all of your research or the researchers in your university? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a very tricky science, and I can't say we're perfect at it yet. We're getting better at it. I think it's about keeping a long-term relationship with your research. So often what we do as academics, we come in, we do a research project, and the project finishes, and then we move on to the next project. I think impact takes longer than that to achieve. It's usually not immediately following the project finishing. It might take 3 to 5 years for that to kind of the research to filter into policy. And so it's keeping that relationship and that, you know, your finger on the pulse, like understanding what government's doing or industry's doing as a result of the research. Some of it's quite easy to measure. So, you know, for example, making sure you're collecting, if your research is featured in a media story or you're quoted in a media story, making sure you're collecting that information. If you hear, you may do a piece of research and then that research is mentioned in a policy document or a government strategy, I think that can be quite impactful as well. I think doing research as consultants for government as well can create impact. So I just went to a meeting this morning. We're writing a major, right up your alley actually, Penny, we're writing a major event strategy for the Gold Coast. And we've been working on that for 6 months, and that will be a high impact strategy, you know, high impact research. I'm not quite sure whether we'll get many academic publications out of it. We may get one, but in terms of impact, this is going to impact the future of the Gold Coast event industry for the next 5 years, probably the next decade. And so for us to kind of measure the impact, we're going to have to keep engaged with the event industry and understand how that strategy is being used, how the information is being used in terms of creating outcomes. Yeah, it's not an exact science in many cases. It's about just collecting information every time you give a presentation or you hear your research mentioned somewhere, and so forth.
Thank you, Sarah, for amazing discussions. I'm looking forward to join research with your events team.
Fantastic. Yeah, great.
Thank you, Sarah. Back to you, Pak Redha. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. I just have one question, Sarah, especially regarding your research pillars, especially for us as the junior researchers in Indonesia and then the Indonesian market as a whole. How should we approach this? Because this is sort of like a new phenomenon in a way. I mean, if we talk about the United States, it has been investigated in the past. So do you have any tips or suggestions? Because like, this is like something new, like something like what I see in Jogja. It's like, that's really interesting, local wisdom. So how me as a researcher who may have an interest and you have looked at the phenomenon and then now wondering whether how can I turn this into an academic impact, a journal or an article?
Yeah, sure.
Contribute, so.
Sure. We wrote an article on the 10 new Balis. It's published in the Journal of Asia Pacific Travel Research, and that was around sustainable livelihoods. And why I mention that is, I think for your research to get interest, particularly I think there's, you know, a key funding source for your research and impact would be government. I think you need to tie tourism into bigger picture issues for Indonesia. That particular paper talked about the role of tourism in terms of creating livelihoods for local economies. And I think if you can think about the big challenges for Indonesia as it grows and develops and the environmental change and things like that, what are some big issues for Indonesia and how could tourism research or event and hospitality research help to tackle those problems? I probably would keep it quite small in terms of if your team is quite small, maybe keep the areas of expertise or focus quite small, maybe just 2 or 3 rather than 4 or 5. Be quite focused in that and try to really think about how, if you address something in tourism, how would that help solve a bigger picture problem for Indonesia?
I also have another questions from one of our esteemed colleague, Redha. They'd like to know what is usually the minimum requirement if we want to do some type of research collaborations with the team at Griffith?
There's not really a minimum requirement. I think there needs to be value on both sides, so both for Griffith and for your university as well. I suppose, a mutual interest in a particular research topic. And I think that's sort of the basis of that type of relationship, to work out, you know, if your area of interest and a researcher of Griffith have a sort of mutual area of interest, and then that opportunity to collaborate on that. I know, you know, there's great interest in Indonesian tourism and how it's developing, and I think that a lot of Australian researchers would be and GIFT researchers, Griffith Institute for Tourism researchers. Sorry, I say GIFT, that's our abbreviation for the institute, would be very interested in how tourism is developing in Indonesia, because it's a very different circumstance in Australia in terms of our tourism industry.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, I just went to Jogja, and it blew my mind in terms of the tourism. You know, it's the fact that in Indonesia, for domestic, for Japanese people, they like to bring their whole big family, which this could be like a group of 40 people to travel on a bus. Yeah, that was revealing. I was like, whoa, okay.
Yeah, so our Australian Tourism Export Council has just been doing some training for Australian operators on how to attract the Indonesian market, and there's lots we need to learn. So I think there's lots of opportunity there around learning about Indonesians and their travel behaviour, because I think as we start to open up, and particularly because we're a bit unsure about what's happening with China, a lot of countries are looking to other countries in Southeast Asia in terms of key target markets, and I know Indonesia is very much on the radar of Australia and probably New Zealand, UK, USA, and so forth. So it's very interesting.
Yeah, I think we have a very huge outbound demand going out. I think Australia is one of it. I know I saw a lot of Garuda Indonesia advertisement to Sydney. So I would probably think New South Wales or the Australian government has been really working hard with our transit system, like just Garuda Indonesia, to make sure to connect both regions.
I think it's also part of the geopolitical sort of push to build ties between Australia and Indonesia, and travel and visiting another, you know, Australians visiting Indonesia and Indonesians visiting Australia as a way to kind of build those cultural ties or understanding between the two countries. So I think there's going to be a lot more focus on that as we move forward.
I thought that you bring a very interesting point about cultural ties and understanding, which probably is not measured as much in tourism as the positive benefits of it. I thought that would really interesting to see how you know, the act of tourism help us to get a better mutual understanding of each other instead of supposed enemies or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that'll be really interesting.
Yeah.
Let me see. Quick. Do we have any other questions, Pak Made?
There is one question from the chat box from Hesti. Hesti mentions that she's currently doing research on batik. Batik is the original product of the country. This product is continuously developed by our government because it depicts Indonesian culture. So what strategy would you suggest to me to make batik as a tourism business or to improve tourism business as part of the Indonesian cultures? I think it has been recognized by UNESCO as well as part of
Fantastic. A couple of things just through the work I do, particularly with community-based tourism and in cultural tourism in Indonesia. I think authenticity is really important. Making sure that although economics is important, making sure that and I think you mentioned this before, Redha, about making sure that the products and the signage and the visitor experience remains authentic. I did visit when I was in Bali, visited a village in Indonesia. It was sort of like a tourist village, but there was lots of Western signage and Western products and things like that available. And I think that takes away from the authenticity. So as much as possible, I try to keep local product not have too much sort of signage, Western sort of signage and billboarding and things like that around around the destination. I also think accessibility is really important. So, and thinking about how many visitors you want to bring into that region, and what's the sort of carrying capacity of the region, how big do you want to get, and think about accessibility. So how would visitors actually get to that location, and then when they're there, what sort of experience would they have? Often the economics of tourism is built on people staying overnight in a particular location. So if you get lots of day trip visitors, so they stay somewhere else, but they come and visit you as a day trip, it can mean that there's a big impact, but not a lot of economic benefit. So whether there's accommodation available there for people to stay overnight in that location, that would also be of interest to make sure you're getting that economic impact as well.
Okay. I thought that was really interesting because I believe your recent paper was about authenticity.
Yes, yeah.
So I thought, well, we could collaborate furthermore about authenticity, which is also the focus of one of my colleagues at Purdue, Ksenia. So it will be really interesting to see how that would also translate to Indonesia's program of bringing local products and local wisdom into their infrastructure as well as their tourism experience as well. I have Pak Hannes also raise hand.
Hello.
Yes.
Hello. Hello, Sarah. My name is Hannes, and and I'm my teaching subject in the school about experience design. Since you mentioned also about experience design earlier, so I have a few questions about it. And in one of the topics in experience design, as you mentioned, about sentiment analysis in developing experience design for tourism. What I want to ask is about how is the result of those kind of analysis is useful for Australian tourism. Could you give us an example of that? And another question is maybe if we want to apply it in Indonesia, that as we know is also strong in community based, is it could be useful for those kind of analysis? I think that is my questions.
Sure. I'll give you an example of where we use sentiment analysis. So we did some work for SeaWorld on the Gold Coast, and SeaWorld is a theme park on the Gold Coast that has marine animals such as dolphins and polar bears and seals and so forth within the park. Back in 2019, Viator and a number of others, TripAdvisor and so forth, stopped selling tickets to parks that had marine animals, particularly marine animals where people could kind of, mammals where people can touch those mammals. So they have like dolphin experiences and so forth. So we looked at Twitter data from the Gold Coast to see whether there was a negative backlash to having the marine animals in the park, particularly captive marine animals. And we analysed the data, and sure enough, there wasn't any negative sentiment towards those animals in the Twitter data. So a lot of that noise was being created by animal activists and so forth, which it's fine for them to have their views and so forth, but to say that the general population felt the same as the animal activists was probably an overstretch. And so that was a good way of using evidence to actually show that, you know, a small group of people can really dominate the messaging. And if you have a look at the general population, there's not that same negative sentiment. So that's a way in which we've looked at sentiment analysis. We also did some work around the bushfires and who was controlling the messaging around the bushfires. And a lot of it was politicians and political messaging. And so again, it just sort of helps us to understand. And the thing I like about big data, there's some things I don't like about it, but the thing I do like about it is that it's organically generated. So when you ask people a question in a survey, you're sort of biasing the data by asking the question, But with social media data, people are just organically creating that data, and when you analyze it, you're getting their thoughts without being prompted. When you ask them a survey question, you're basically prompting them for an answer, and so that's what I like about that sort of data. It is a bit trickier to analyze, and it's messy. I like surveys because I can ask a question, and I can ask particularly about what I really want to know about in the survey. But when I use big data, I have no control over, I might want to ask this question, but the data doesn't give me that answer. And so when we did the bushfire data using the Twitter data, we wanted to know about what people thought about tourism during the bushfires. And sure enough, that was hardly even mentioned in the Twitter data. So we couldn't really write about what people thought about tourism during the bushfires because there was no data in the Twitter data to talk about that. So I think there's pros and cons of each sort of data set. So I think that's why it's sometimes good to have multiple data collection and analysis points to see the problem from different perspectives, which you saw on the barrier reef data, where we had like a survey and stakeholder survey and Twitter data and a number of different data points to really understand that. As well, it's not always easy to collect big data as well. We have a big data smart analytics lab here at Griffith, so they're collecting Twitter data all the time, but sometimes it's a bit hard to get access to that data. It's not sort of always readily available.
Oh, okay. Based on your explanation, I think it's been a chaos of data, and then maybe we can also use another analysis to help the sentiment analysis. Just like maybe we can use just like social networks. So and then we can analyze from where the data came from, and then maybe it's like that. Is it like that? We can combine it with another type of analysis, so we can really make sure what groups that send the resources of it, and then is it any I want to ask about the usage of this analysis. Can we implement it into a program? It's like what we try to give the lessons to our students is how you create maybe a tourism program is based on the data, and then you have to look your surrounding. That's a basic of design thinking. And then what I want to ask is about is there, or is sentimental analysis is influence big enough to the creation of the program, or just to see a feedback? So it's used for controlling, but not many to creating.
I'm not sure if I'm going to answer your question particularly, but often when we do the sentiment analysis, we also use text analysis software and start to work out what the message themes are. So use software such as Leximancer to work out what message themes are in the data as well. So I think sentiment analysis by itself is probably not that insightful. But when you triangulate it with some other analysis, such as text-based analysis, or maybe looking at your survey data or case study data or other things that you've got, it can be quite insightful as to why people feel either positive or negative or neutral towards a particular topic or theme. But then doing some of that text-based analysis, you can dig a little bit deeper into what are the key messages, and you also mentioned like social network analysis, who are sending those messages, and that perhaps gives you insight into what that theme. It is quite difficult getting this published in academic journals, to tell you the truth, because it is quite practically orientated, and you've got to remember the academic journals want a theoretical contribution. So I think when you design research using sentiment analysis and big data and that sort of thing, you need to think about what theoretical contribution you're making by doing that analysis, because just doing sentiment analysis isn't that new now in terms of the academic journals.
Yeah. And about the second question, is it applicable for Indonesian tourism perspective, which is, I think, is kind of try to be more into community-based than mass tourism right now. It's like in the Jogja or maybe another cities. Is it can be applicable also?
Yeah, to do sentiment analysis, you need a fairly large data set. Yep. So you would need to think about that in terms of your research design. Where we're seeing it used quite a lot, maybe not so much in terms of visitor sentiment, but definitely community sentiment in terms of the impacts of tourism on the community. So then you'll get a larger data set because more people are tweeting or posting about the impacts of tourism on their life, or not being able to go to the shops because it's too busy, or the car park being full, or there's lots of traffic on the roads and things like that. So I think you'll probably be able to use it that way. It's sometimes hard unless you've got a big visitor population to really pick up visitor sentiment as such. Using big data, you might be able to pick that up better through survey data.
I think that's all question for me. Thank you for your answer. Thank you, Mr. Redha.
Nice meeting you.
Thank you, Pak Hannes. I thought that was really interesting about sentiment analysis. It's sort of in a way that you can also induce, like, as an inductive tool to understand about the phenomenon in the new market, I believe, right, Sarah? And then is it possible to do then deductive research then, and we start looking what theories we could apply there? Or
yeah, I think so, but I think you've got, it's hard in some ways, because with sentiment analysis and big data, you're not quite sure what you're going to find sometimes. So sometimes it's hard to think of the theoretical perspective before you do the research. So sometimes that's the challenge with this in terms of getting it published in academic journals, is thinking about that theoretical contribution that you can make using these types of methodologies.
Do you have any further questions? I know the time is nearing its end. We are at 10:34.
Well, I have two comments, Pak Redha, if I can.
Yes.
I missed the slides of Sarah related with tourism topic clustering. Can you share later on, Sarah, about you mentioned about 3 topics and then you clustering in. I saw that
in the clustering. Yes, yeah. I think
I can catch all.
Yes, I believe we were gonna share the materials, Pak Pangki.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Okay, good.
Will it be possible for you to share your presentation, Sarah, to us?
Yes, I've emailed it to you, so you should. You might have to PDF it though, because it's quite a large file. So maybe just PDF it before you share it with others.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Pak Pangki. Any other questions for Sarah? Okay, since we don't have any further questions, let me just say from the Tourism Business Department how grateful we are to have you to be with us at Universitas Prasetiya Mulya, giving us lectures about research and also showing us what Griffith has been up to in terms of Institute of Tourism and the impact it has on the tourism community as well as the local community at Queensland. I really truly appreciate it, and we hope to have you again, and then probably a colleague of yours and Pak Made maybe in the future as a guest lecturer in our speaker series. Would you like to have 1 or 2 words or short words about this session today, Sarah?
Yeah, I thank you so much for the invitation to speak at your inaugural research session, which is fantastic. Yeah, happy to talk further at future sessions, but also if there's particular topics of interest, maybe you can reach out to me and we can identify a researcher within our institute that has that particular, works in that particular area. I think that's a great opportunity. Yeah, there's so much work that can be done in Indonesia, and it's very exciting times, I think, for your country in terms of the development of its tourism industry, and particularly creating sustainable livelihoods for communities around tourism. I think that's a real opportunity there. So looking forward to visiting Indonesia very shortly, and looking forward to getting back over there again, and yeah, continuing this conversation around collaboration. I think it's fantastic.
For sure, we will continue our conversation furthermore, and we would like you to come to our university to visit, as we have probably next semester we have moved from our online teaching now to offline. So we would love to have you at the Prasetiya Mulya University. Thank you so much. That concludes our speaker session today, our inaugural speaker session for today. Hopefully, please fill in the survey so we can improve our speaker series and invite more distinguished, interesting speaker that could inspire you and give you a lot of insights in terms of the tourism world, both research also on the practical trends that are going on in the tourism, Indonesia or globally. We always strive at tourism business to bring new innovations and create meaningful experiences and meaningful impacts for our local communities. So, so this has definitely been giving us a lot of aspirations to further our goals, our missions and visions. Thank you, Dr. Gardiner. Thank you, Pak Made. And thank you for the participants. I would like to thank also our administration, our staff, Mbak Lely, Miss Lely, for helping arrange us this Zoom meeting, and all of you also watching from far. Thank you all, and we hope to visit you soon. See you later, and salam pariwisata. Terima kasih.
Thank you, Professor.
Terima kasih.
See you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you, Pak Redha.
Thank you, Pak Redha.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Pak Made.
Bye-bye.
Siap semua.
Cheers.